There are very few moments in history that we can point to and say, at this moment, everything changed. These are really extraordinary. There are very often times when particular actions, historical events, and individuals all came together. They're almost never recognizable at the time, and they almost always include body counts. But in this lecture, we are going to look at one of these moments where we can say very clearly that a line is drawn in history, and afterwards, everything has changed. In this case, changed in terms of city development. This is the lecture we're going to cover, Orthogonal Planning Coming to Greek Cities. And it did so thanks to the work of Hippodamian of Miletus. He is known as the father of urban planning, which is why we refer to the Greek manifestation of orthogonal planning as Hippodamian planning. The Hippodamian plan builds on the orthogonal planning that we saw earlier, for example, at Kahun in Egypt, but that had not previously been seen in Greek cities. Hippodamian is credited with being the first Greek city planner to use orthogonal planning. That is, the use of broad avenues crossed by streets at right angles to create blocks. But he did something more. He decided that the layout and design of the city should deliberately reflect the community's social order, and not its actual social order, but an ideal social order. He felt strongly that the problems that cities had were based on poor design as well as poorly ordered government, and that the two problems were related. That's why, when called upon to write a new constitution for the Greek city of Miletus, he also redesigned the city in this new pattern. His solution was to join the two, city form and city government, in a single community. And he had that opportunity with the rebuilding of Miletus in 479 BC. Now, I think it's important to point out that Miletus, along with other cities, is in the region of Ionia. That is referred to in antiquity as East Greece. It is now Western Turkey. And it's the area along the western coast of Turkey. That's all Ionia to the Greeks. And so buildings like Ionic columns and Ionic temples come from this area. This all had to be rebuilt, almost all of the cities along here, because they were destroyed by the Persian Empire in the Great Persian Wars. The Persian Wars, familiar to us through the names of battles such as Marathon and Thermopylae. I mention this because the city is in an area occupied by the ancient Greeks, but in close proximity to the advanced, much older urban civilizations of Asia. This proximity may have been a factor in the development of Hippodamian planning. Unless you believe in parallel development, and I always love that in Star Trek when they go out, into the galaxy and find aliens who live these amazingly Earth-like civilizations and all speak English and everything. Parallel development. It's great in science fiction. In reality, not so much. Unless you actually believe in parallel development, it seems very likely that what we have here is in Miletus is Hippodamian at least having heard of Near Eastern and Egyptian cities that were designed with orthogonal planning. He may even have visited them personally. And in fact, I think that's probably likely. Certainly his culture encouraged exploration and personal discovery. He's living in a region with a tradition of scientific and historical inquiry. Ionia is not as well known as Athens. We don't hear about it as much because we have so much material from Athens. But Ionia was the site not just for the revolt against the Persians that launched the Persian Wars, but of a scientific revolution during which education and scientific inquiry flourished for about 200 years under great thinkers such as Thales of Miletus, who is regarded as the father of science. Ionia was also home to the contemporary, that is 5th century BC historian Herodotus, who came from Halicarnassus, about 30 miles away from Miletus. So, how does design reflect social order? In this case, in the case of Miletus, in terms of placement and proportions. That is, the size of the blocks that Hippodamian laid out in the new city of Miletus differ depending on the category of use. That is, whether they are public, sacred, or private. And by private, we mean residential. And of course, the arrangement of these components of society takes on a significance. As a proponent of democracy, Hippodamus deliberately created private blocks, that is, the blocks that held all of the residential areas, that were very similar in size. That means he is creating spaces where all men are created equal. In fact, the city joins together, almost seamlessly, a political philosophy with practicality. We have the testimony of Aristotle on this point, as he describes Miletus. He says, quote, well, in translation, quote, "The city of Hippodamus was composed of 10,000 citizens, divided into three parts. One of artisans, that is, those people who make things, one of farmers, and a third of the armed defenders of the state. He, Hippodamus, also divided the land into three parts, one sacred, one public, the third private. The first was set aside to maintain the customary worship of the gods, the second was to support the warriors, and the third was the property of the farmers. He also divided laws into three classes, and no more, for he maintained that there are three subjects of lawsuits: insult, injury, and homicide." End quote. Well, these divisions, that is the social divisions, the division of law we can't actually see, but the social divisions can be readily seen in the plan and layout of the city. Well, we have our really public areas that occupy a broad central zone across the city, with housing blocks almost evenly divided to the north and south of that. These public larger blocks give common space for civic, commercial, and religious activities in a way that I think is roughly familiar to us from the downtown of a small city in the United States, where you find all of those things: civic, commercial, and religious spaces. And that's certainly the case, that these are all located here. We see the community civic buildings and so on in that central location. However, in most of our planned communities, we don't create blocks in the center that are double or treble the size of the residential blocks. That is an indicator of privileging of space. The residential blocks are all identical, and those larger areas in the center are more important, therefore larger. I should point out that what we have here, Aristotle gave us the number of 10,000 citizens. We calculate that to mean about a population overall of about 50,000 people in Miletus in the 5th century BC. Now that central zone was overseen by the elected officials, whose election and duties were also described by Aristotle. Quote, "As to the city officials, he would have them all elected by the people, that is, by the three classes already mentioned. And those who were elected were to watch over the interests of the public, of strangers, and of orphans." End quote. A couple of things I want to point out about this before we go any further. Aristotle's quotes are great, but they point out one of the, I think, weaknesses of the Hippodamian ideal, and that is everything is divided into thirds. Okay? The public, the strangers, the orphans, the city is divided into thirds. There are three kinds of laws. Everything is divided into thirds. It seems very neat, but it's also very artificial. Keep in mind that this is the ideal. And I think, in fact, when it reached reality, it didn't always work so cleanly as Hippodamus had it laid out. So when you see that division of everything into thirds, what you see, I think, is that ancient notion of neatness, of the ideal. Not really, I think, the way things are going to turn out for Hippodamus or Miletus. Well, the interests of the public obviously included a great amount of trade, as we have large spaces that stretch from the harbor to the center of the city. And these make it clear that what Hippodamus has done has created these zones which create the core of the city and really make it possible to have long-range trade and bulk commodities moving in and out of the city, from the harbor to the center where they'll be sold. Aristotle, who is absolutely critical as a source, since the constitution that Hippodamus wrote no longer exists, finally concludes in his passage on this, quote, "Hippodamus, the son of Eurofon, a native of Miletus, the same who invented the art of planning cities, was the first person, not a statesman, who made inquiries about the best form of government." End quote. Unless you've read a lot of Aristotle, this may not seem notable. It is shocking. Aristotle, who based most of his work on rejecting the opinions of earlier experts, credits Hippodamus as the inventor of the art of planning cities, is remarkable and a powerful indicator of the influence of the Hippodamian planning. That influence, of course, continues today in the design of cities. But more interestingly, Hippodamus presented something of a model to other city and constitutional planners. Thomas Jefferson, whose work designing the University of Virginia was based on Hippodamian principles, is, I think, the most important of these individuals. He designed the university campus to reflect his philosophy of education, not just the practicalities of getting around. With that philosophy of education, he placed the library at the symbolic center of campus. In fact, he was inspired by Hippodamian notions of government as well in his new proposal to divide the new United States government into 3 sections or 3 branches. Thomas Jefferson, not a professional architect or designer, is truly the intellectual descendant of Hippodamus. I think there's no better example of the influence of Hippodamus or the model he gives to us, really up to the modern world, than Thomas Jefferson's life. Well, one element of Hippodamian planning not mentioned by Aristotle, yet critical to its success, and also, frankly, an example of its flexibility, is the use of the Stoa. Now, I've mentioned the Stoa in previous lectures on Athens. The Stoa is a Greek architectural form, that is, it's actually a Greek invention, that can be defined as a portico or roofed colonnade, with a line of columns along the front side, generally facing a street or an open piazza, an open square, and a solid wall across the back and solid sides. The Stoa is a very flexible form because it's essentially modular. The module is the intercolumnar distance, and it can be made any length and, frankly, varying widths, as long as you have enough timbers to make the roof trusses. The actual width, that is the depth of the Stoa, is limited by the number of long timber pieces you can get to make up those roof beams across that run unbroken from the front to the back. But the length can be any length because those are short pieces of wood and of stone, and you can just expand this forever. You can also expand it up to 2 stories when desired, and the Greeks did. The rear supporting wall is a load-bearing wall, but it can be pierced with doors for a line of rooms behind. That pattern, that model of the Stoa, with a covered walkway in the front and a line of rooms behind, becomes, in fact, the model for almost every Greek city. We find these Stoas lining public spaces, public streets, public squares, really across Greek cities. It becomes the model, and I say this derisively sometimes, but actually it's important. It becomes the model for the strip mall, effectively, with a covered walkway in front and a line of shops behind. An almost ubiquitous form in modern America because it is so flexible. It's applicable. You can have corridor development where you line these up along streets. Narrow versions of the Stoa can go up anywhere over just existing sidewalks to create covered walkways that run throughout a city. These Stoa, perhaps unsurprisingly, were used earliest on the most important roads, so that Stoas created a sort of armature through the city that made the significant avenues visually distinct. And this is important because houses at the time are largely rubble made, not cut stone, not with lines of columns. And so what you have with these lines of Stoas is really an extraordinary visual marker of the important areas of the community. They create lines that you move down, which tell you about privileging of space. The Romans eagerly adopted this Greek invention, so much so that it's claimed by the historian Livy, in fact, that at Rome in the late Republic, one could walk across the city in the shade thanks to all the stoas that were built in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. So the stoa defines the city. Well, in addition to their use lining major roads, stoas were also flexible enough that they could be used as a framing device along all 4 sides of a square. Public areas, notably the agora or public square of a Greek city, were further architecturally enhanced by these forms. Essentially, it creates a frame around this public area. It gives it a formality and a structure, and it marks it out visually as significant public space. So these forms, by their almost ubiquitous use, meant that stoas become that visual marker of all public spaces in the city. Single stoas became the 4-sided porticos that later surrounded Greek sanctuaries and Roman forums. So the use actually continues for hundreds of years. Another element of city design that distinguished public areas was the grand formal entrance, a propylon in Greek, and that's a large formal entryway. This also developed in the Ionian region of eastern Greece at and around Miletus. It's probably inspired by the Near Eastern tradition of grand entryways. Greek cities began to create large architectural frames for their city gates and for agora or market entrances. These entrances, or formal gateways, were often 2 or 3 stories in height, composed of alternating bays of projecting and receding units, and were used as frames for sculptures, which were generally placed in niches along each story of the facade. Many of these formal entrances were found in Eastern Greek communities, and their statue groups of patron deities, personifications of the community, and local elites served to define the community to all who entered the space, whether it was the city itself or the market square. Now think about this for just a minute. What this means is if you have one of these formal gateways at the city gate, that is at the very entrance of the city, with a sculpture group of the gods, the personification of the city, local elites, that is local elites who paid for public building, that is connected by a line of stoas that flank a major street to the major public areas, the agora, the market square, and so on. And so what you've created really are armatures of privileged space throughout the city, which are further enhanced with these formal structures on either end. And so it really changes, I think, the way one engages with the city. Certainly in antiquity, a city that you're used to of, well, could be mud brick, but more likely rubble houses. Suddenly you have these grand formal 1 or 2-story spaces that really, I think, give you a sense of the importance of the public areas in the community. For one type of building, however, Hippodamus had to vary from his rigid plan of rectilinear blocks. Probably killed him to do it, but the theater at Miletus, like all Greek theaters, had to be built into a hillside. Greek theaters have no freestanding substructure. They use solid rock, so that the seating area is supported by the bedrock of the hill. In this case, at Miletus, it's placed along the slope of a hill and is the one major feature in the city that does not line up with the orientation of the city blocks. I've often wondered seriously how much that one exception might have distressed Hippodamus. Hippodamian planning, once it was seen at the newly refounded Miletus, and traditionally the date is 479 BC, but we don't know actually how long it took to build. But once it was there, it became all the rage. We can see its slightly later application just up the coast, at the site of Ephesus, another of the leading Ionian cities. Now, Hippodamus had no interest in dramatic presentation or visual effects or the integration of the city with its landscape. Now, I want to clarify here, I've talked about these formal entryways, these gates, these propyla, which we find. Those are not made for dramatic presentation. They're formal, they're monumental, but they're not designed to evoke a great sense of wonder on those who view them. And I think that distinction will be clear later on when we talk about the city of Pergamon. It creates, I think, a very strong contrast to Miletus. So we have things that I think are formalized and monumental, but not selected or designed for some stunning, dramatic, or visual effect. What Hippodamus did at Miletus and then later at Ephesus is imposed his plan of blocks on the available landscape without regard for topography. It's as though he gridded out the city on a piece of paper and held it over and laid it out on the irregular surface of where they wanted to have the city and just imposed it directly. There are, as with any endeavor or plan, weaknesses and downsides to Hippodamian planning. For example, its rigid application to sites that are mountainous or even very hilly leads to some streets too steep for wheeled traffic. What that means at Ephesus, in some cases, streets that run up the slope turn into flights of stairs just to deal with the steep slope. You're walking along and suddenly you have this flight of very steep steps that you have to take in order to keep that street going dead straight up the hillside. No switchbacks or rambling streets. Not in a Hippodamian city. You can't take that in a wheeled vehicle. I know. I tried this once in Sicily. I was going down a very steep road in a small town in Sicily. It made a corner, nice right-angled corner, and then right-angled corner back, and it turned into a flight of stairs. I was stuck. I got the car out, but it took a while, and the temptation to abandon it was actually very strong. Anyway, it didn't go well. At Priene and Ephesus, two of the Ionian cities that are based on the design at Miletus, for example, terracing was needed to fit the plan to the landscape, and certain streets just become staircases at some point. One refinement of Hippodamian planning at Ephesus is seen at the theater, which is constructed oriented with the streets. Again, this is in contrast to Miletus, where the theater is the outlier in the plan. At Ephesus, it's part of the inflexible application of the design to the landscape. Essentially, the planning at Ephesus is even more rigidly applied to the landscape than at Miletus. I imagine Hippodamus smiling at this little victory of design over nature. I'm still not entirely sure how they did that, but it's pretty impressive if you get a chance to see it. Another refinement at Ephesus is the further use of stoas to line key avenues in the city. Here at Ephesus, notably the major road from the harbor to the center of Ephesus. The Ephesians developed this idea, the idea of the stoa, to create a framework that distinguishes certain streets above others. To the stoa, they add the sculptural display that was previously found in the formal entryways at the agoras or at city gates. Statues are placed on brackets anchored to the columns of the colonnades that line the street, so that each side of the street becomes a long line of sculptural display as well as columns. In some cases, the sidewalks under the colonnades are covered with floor mosaics on the major public streets. These refinements are a direct development of Hippodamian planning elements and of that idea of privileging of public spaces above the residential. Another result of Hippodamian planning is the invention of the terrace house. This is not so much an invention as a desperate necessity. Well, I guess it's an invention based on necessity. A number of these terrace houses are found at Ephesus, in which the rooms are each on a different level, often rising room by room via small terraces from the front that runs along the street to the rear of the house. This adjustment was necessary because of the rigid application of the plan to the steep slopes of the hills in the city, with streets laid out straight up the slopes of the hills. Unless you wanted to live at a 45-degree angle, and really who hasn't, each house had to be cut into the bedrock in a series of individual terraces, moving away from the street and up the slope. Now, Hippodamus is also credited by Aristotle with laying out Piraeus, the harbor town, what we might call the warehouse district of Athens. As at Ephesus, the orthogonal scheme was applied without regard to the irregular topography. In fact, you can still walk streets today that follow the Hippodamian plan. I'd advise doing some cardio before you go, maybe running the stairs at your local stadium, because they're steep. But in honor of Hippodamus, the Agora at Piraeus was named for him. That's quite an honor, actually. There's no doubt that Hippodamius had a bold vision for Greek cities. He, for the first time, decided that cities should be designed from the outset to reflect their constitutions and their social orders. In fact, order was pretty much the watchword of his city planning. He imposed order on the chaos that had previously existed in Greek cities. The idea took hold, and in his lifetime transformed the expectations for cities. In fact, it may have been at least partially responsible for a great surge of city foundations that occurred in the 200 years after his death, as Greeks actually abandoned some cities they'd lived in for centuries to refound them under Hippodamian planning. Of course, his influence continued far beyond that. I've already referred to Thomas Jefferson and his debt to Hippodamus. In addition, without Hippodamus, I think it's impossible to imagine the work of Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the designer of Washington, D.C. Its layout, particularly the arrangement of public buildings with the Capitol building at the center, is a design based on the emphasis on the importance of that branch of government, a Hippodamian idea. The arrangements of Hippodamus in creating different districts for, among other things, commercial and government activities inspired the rational modernist work of urban planners such as Robert Moses, whose designs called for separate districts for different activities. Robert Moses is incredibly influential, particularly in the mid-20th century. He designed cities that have been copied, which have separate zones for industrial activities, commercial activities, civic activities, and residential zones. And so when you look at cities that really sprawl out so that you shop in one place, live in another, work in another, that is really, I think, based on the work of Robert Moses. It's a rational form of modernist design. Of course, the debate about the extent and limits of this form of design is ongoing, with other influential planners, such as Jane Jacobs, arguing that they've gone too far. Jane Jacobs has rejected that notion of modernist planning to create what is in fact she's sort of the grandmother of what we term new urbanism. She's a proponent of mixed-use communities where you live, work, shop, and worship all in a small neighborhood. She, I think, owes something to Hippodamus in the size of the blocks and the notion of a pedestrian city, which is taken directly from the ancient Greek cities. Now, wherever you fall on the spectrum, from the modernist to the mixed use, what's important to realize is that the vocabulary and, in fact, the arguments of all of this have already been framed by Hippodamus of Miletus. We're just debating based on decisions he took 2,500 years ago. This lecture has focused on city design and layout, with no mention or very little mention of residential spaces or domestic life. For those in a Hippodamian city, we turn next to the extraordinary site at Olynthus, where we can not only trace the city plan and walk some of the public areas, but explore houses, in fact, whole neighborhoods of the classical Greek era. It'll give us a better idea of just how people lived in one of these Hippodamian cities.